The dog didn't belong to him. That was the first thing Logan Hurst noticed. A yellow Labrador, somebody's pet, straining at the end of a blue nylon leash in the parking lot of the Powell County Animal Shelter in Deer Lodge, Montana, on a Tuesday morning in October, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the air carried the first real cold of the season. The lab's owner, a woman in her 60s with a gray braid and a canvas coat, was trying to get the dog back toward her car. The dog was having none of it. He had planted his feet at the edge of the parking lot, facing the fenced run on the south side of the shelter, hackles just barely raised, and was pulling toward that fence with the low, steady insistence of an animal that has decided something matters and is not prepared to be argued out of it. Logan had been on his way out. He had come to drop off a donated bag of food on behalf of the VFW post in town, and had spent 8 minutes inside and was heading back to his truck. He stopped when he saw the lab. He didn't know why he stopped. He told himself later it was because the woman looked like she needed help managing the dog. He didn't fully believe that explanation then, and he doesn't believe it now. He looked toward the run the lab was straining toward. He didn't understand what he was looking at yet. He would understand in about 30 seconds, and nothing about his life would be the same after. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. What Logan saw in that shelter run is the kind of thing that people who witnessed it will never stop talking about for as long as they live. Staff Sergeant Logan Hurst was 39 years old, and the years had given his face the quality of something pressed and set rather than worn. Not aged exactly, but defined. The way good wood gets defined by weather. He was 5'11" and lean in a way that suggested the leanness was maintained by discipline rather than metabolism. With brown hair cut close and the beginning of gray at his temples that had arrived at 36 and apparently decided it was satisfied. His eyes were a pale, clear gray that people described as calm, until they spent enough time with him to understand that calm was not quite the right word. The right word was level. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to receive information without immediately reacting to it, who had trained the gap between perception and response until it was wide enough to be useful, and who had never fully untrained it after leaving service. He had the particular stillness of men who have operated in environments where stillness was a survival skill, and who carry that stillness into kitchens and parking lots and conversations about nothing, not because they're trying to, but because it has become the way they exist in the world. He had served 12 years with the 1st Marine Division, 2 deployments to Afghanistan's Helmand Province, 1 to Fallujah in the late years of the Iraq campaign, and a final rotation to Kandahar that had ended in the spring of 2022 with an honorable separation and a shrapnel scar along his right forearm that had healed clean and flat, and that he sometimes ran his thumb across without thinking about it, the way you touch something familiar. He had come home to Powell County because his mother was there, and because Deer Lodge was the kind of small Montana town where nobody needed him to explain himself, which was what he needed most at the time. He did construction work and occasionally volunteered at the county VFW post and lived in a house on the east side of town with a front porch that faced the mountains and no particular plan beyond next month, which he had decided was sufficient for now. He had carried with him, every day since the spring of 2022, the specific weight of having lost Ranger. Ranger had been a 4-year-old German Shepherd when they deployed together to Kandahar on Logan's last rotation. He was black and tan with a coat so dense it seemed to add weight to the dog even in warm weather, rich and deep along his back and shoulders, lighter along his flanks, with amber eyes that processed the world in the quick, layered way of an animal running multiple assessments simultaneously. He had weighed 84 pounds at his operational peak, and had moved with the particular economy of a trained working dog. No wasted steps, no unnecessary sounds. The kind of controlled competence that made people who didn't know working dogs assume he was somehow exceptional, and made people who did know them understand he was simply very well made and very well trained. He had a scar on his right shoulder, pink and coin-sized, from a fragment during a vehicle search outside Spin Boldak. The kind of scar that heals and leaves behind a permanent thinning of the fur. A patch of slightly paler coat that Logan had touched every single time he ran his hand across Ranger's shoulder in the 2 years they worked together. The partnership line in Logan's deployment record read, "Exceptional operational bond, superior coordination. Recommended for continued paired assignment." What it didn't record was the way Ranger slept directly against Logan's leg on patrol bases in weather that required both of them to generate warmth. Or the way the dog would press his head against Logan's shin whenever Logan sat still long enough for it. A handler and his WD build a language that has no dictionary. You learn what each piece of stillness means, what each shift of posture is saying, what the difference is between the alert that means something is wrong and the alert that means something is interesting. After 2 years, Logan could read Ranger the way he read terrain, not consciously, not with effort, but the way you read something you know so well you've stopped being aware you're reading it at all. The vehicle accident that took Ranger had happened on a route clearance patrol on a March morning outside Kandahar. Not a combat incident. A rollover on an icy mountain road, the kind of accident that happens in a second and cannot be undone. The vehicle had gone off the embankment. Logan had been thrown clear, and it sustained the shrapnel wound to his forearm and a concussion severe enough to hospitalize him for 5 days. Ranger had been in the rear compartment. The official report, which Logan had read and reread and finally put in a box under his bed, stated that the military working dog had sustained injuries inconsistent with survival and had been humanely euthanized at the scene by the attending veterinary technician. Logan had believed the report. He had had no reason not to. He had come home and had done the work of believing it, the slow and unglamorous work of accepting that something is finished. He had been doing that work for 18 months when he drove to the shelter on a Tuesday morning in October to drop off a bag of donated kibble. The Powell County Animal Shelter occupied a low concrete building on the south edge of town, the kind of structure built for function rather than comfort, with fluorescent lights in the intake area and the continuous background smell of institutional cleaner fighting a war of attrition against the smell of dogs. The kennels ran along the south side of the building, separated from the parking lot by a chain-link fence. On most mornings, the dogs in the outdoor run could be seen from the lot. Shelter dogs doing what shelter dogs do, working through the circuit of their limited space with the particular restlessness of animals who have energy and no meaningful outlet for it. One dog in the far end of the outdoor run was not doing that. Logan had not looked at it directly yet. He had been watching the lab, and then he had looked toward what the lab was looking at, and then he had stopped moving. The dog in the far corner of the run was a German Shepherd. Black and tan. Dense coat. Leaned through the middle in the way of dogs who have not been eating quite enough. He was sitting against the chain link in the far corner, with his back mostly to the parking lot, the way a trained dog sits when it has assessed an environment and found nothing in it worth orienting toward. Ears up. Body still. Not the restlessness of a shelter dog, the stillness of something else entirely. Logan didn't know yet. He was only looking. But his feet had stopped. He didn't know yet what the dog had found. He would understand later. Much later. And when he did, he would think about the yellow lab for a long time. About whatever it is that one dog can sense in another that human instruments cannot measure. and about the question of whether the word providence applies to things that happen in animal shelter parking lots in small Montana towns on cold October mornings. The woman with the braid, her name was Carol Steffens, and she had been bringing her lab, Biscuit, to the shelter for 3 years as a part of an informal comfort dog visiting program that the shelter staff had never formalized but had quietly come to rely on, was still trying to get Biscuit back toward the car. Biscuit was not moving. He had his front paws dug into the gravel and his eyes fixed on the run and his tail doing something that was not quite a wag, something more urgent, more directed, the kind of tail movement that communicates not happiness but recognition of something important. Logan walked to the fence. He looked at the dog in the corner of the run. The dog turned its head. It turned the way Ranger had always turned, not at the sound of his name, not at a command, but at the specific frequency of Logan's footsteps, which Ranger had known from 100 feet in any direction since the first month they had worked together. The turn was slow, complete, and the dog looked at Logan across 30 feet of gravel and chain link with amber eyes. And Logan looked at the dog, and his right hand went to the fence without his permission and gripped the chain link, and he stood there for a moment that had no useful length. The dog had a scar on its right shoulder, a coin-sized patch of paler fur where the coat had grown back thinner than the rest. Logan's throat closed. He stood at the fence for a long moment, with both hands on the chain link, and his jaw set, and his eyes doing something he had given himself permission to do in private and not in parking lots. He stood there until he had enough control to take the next step. And then he walked into the shelter. The woman at the intake desk was named Patrice, and she had worked at the Powell County shelter for 11 years, and had developed over that time a reliable instinct for the difference between people who came in with questions and people who came in with urgency. Logan Hurst was the second kind. She had him in front of the shelter director within 4 minutes. The shelter director was a man named Gary Fenn. Fenn was 53 years old and had run the Powell County Animal Control and Shelter operation for 9 years under an appointment from the county commission that renewed automatically as long as no formal complaint was sustained. He was a thick, unhurried man with close-cut gray hair and the manner of someone who had spent years turning questions into paperwork delays, the specific competence of an administrator who has learned that most people will accept a process if you describe it confidently enough. The shelter operated on a county budget of $180,000 annually, which Fenn managed with a flexibility that the county commission had never looked at closely enough to question. Transfer fees for dogs leaving the shelter were recorded at one rate in the public ledger and collected at another in practice. The difference over 9 years had been consistent and substantial. Fenn had never been audited. He had 2 commissioners who received his quarterly reports without reading them, and one who had stopped asking questions after a conversation that Fenn had arranged over lunch 3 years ago, and that he was confident the commissioner preferred not to revisit. Working dogs had come through the shelter before. Powell County sat within driving distance of several military installations, and the informal and sometimes irregular pipeline by which military working dogs were separated from their records and transferred through civilian channels had deposited 3 animals at the shelter in the past 4 years. Fenn had documented each of them as standard strays. He had transferred each of them to a private buyer at fees that did not appear in the county ledger. The private buyers were serious people who wanted serious dogs and who did not ask questions about provenance. The arrangement suited everyone involved, which was the only criterion Fenn applied to arrangements. The German Shepherd in the outdoor run had arrived at the shelter 6 days ago. His intake paperwork listed him as a stray, male, approximately 6 years, no microchip recorded on intake scan. The no microchip notation was false. Fenn had scanned the dog himself. He had seen the chip number. He had looked up the number in the federal MEBWD database and had seen the name Ranger and the unit designation and the handler assignment and the status notation, which read, euthanized, March 2022, Kandahar Province. He had looked at the dog for a while. He had decided the status notation simplified things considerably, since a dog the government believed dead could not, technically, be reported missing. He had filed the intake form as a stray. He had already been in contact with a buyer in Billings who had expressed interest. The sale was scheduled for Thursday. It was Tuesday morning. Logan had 2 days. He did not know any of this yet when he sat down across from Fenn in the shelter director's office. He knew only what he had seen at the fence. He asked, with complete evenness, to see the intake records for the German Shepherd in the South Outdoor Run. "That dog is in our standard intake process," Fenn said. "We don't release intake records to the public." "I'm not the public," Logan said. "That dog is a United States Marine Corps military working dog. His service number is chipped in his left shoulder. I was his handler." Fenn looked at him for a moment. Not the look of a man surprised, the look of a man recalculating. "Animals that come to us as strays are processed through our standard protocol," he said. "If you believe you have a claim on this animal, you'll need to file a formal claim with the county, which takes a minimum of 10 business days to." 10 business days, Logan said. "That's correct. This dog is scheduled to be transferred to a private buyer before 10 business days have passed." Fenn's expression did not change. "I'm not in a position to discuss the status of specific animals." Logan looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. He stood up. He thanked Fenn for his time in a tone that Patrice, who heard it through the closed office door, would later describe as the quietest thing she had ever found frightening. He walked out of the office and stood in the intake area for a moment with his hand on the counter. And Biscuit, who Carol had brought inside because the dog had refused to leave the parking lot, walked directly to Logan and pressed against his leg and stayed there. Logan took out his phone. He called his former company gunnery sergeant, now retired in Billings, who had a contact at the Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division. He called a Veterans Affairs attorney in Helena, who had handled a WD wrongful transfer case 2 years prior. He called a journalist at the Billings Gazette who had covered military animal welfare issues and who answered on the second ring and said she'd been looking for a reason to look at Powell County shelter finances for over a year. And then he called the county commissioner's office and left a message that was polite, specific, and contained the phrase federal jurisdiction 3 times. He had done all of this by noon. Fenn had not been idle. By 1 in the afternoon, he had contacted his buyer in Billings and moved the transfer to Wednesday morning, 1 day earlier than planned. He had also, according to phone records, subpoenaed the following week, called the commissioner he had lunched with 3 years ago. That call lasted 11 minutes. The commissioner did not return it. Inside the outdoor run, Ranger had moved to the section of fence closest to the shelter's intake door. He was not pacing. He was sitting. He had been sitting in that specific spot since Logan had walked back inside, and he had not moved from it in 3 hours, which the shelter tech who fed the evening rounds noted in her log, and which she found, in a way she couldn't precisely articulate. Quietly remarkable. At 7:14 that evening, Logan received a text from the SID contact. It read, "Chip confirmed. Record discrepancy flagged. Federal hold issued. Nobody moves that dog." Logan read the message twice. He set the phone face down on the kitchen table. He sat with his hands flat on the table for a while, in the particular stillness of a man who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. What followed took 9 days in full and involved a federal investigation that was, by any measure, overdue. The SID inquiry into the Powell County shelter's intake records established that Fenn had falsified documentation on 4 military working dogs over 6 years, collecting undisclosed transfer fees totaling $31,400 that had not been reported to the county. The Billings Gazette published its investigation on a Thursday, 14 days after Logan walked into that shelter. The county commission voted to remove Fenn from his position the following Monday. He was subsequently charged with theft by a public servant and falsification of government records. He was sentenced in February to 32 months, with restitution ordered to the county. The buyer in Billings, who had knowingly purchased military working dogs without verifying provenance on at least 2 prior occasions, was separately charged and pleaded no contest. Logan drove to the shelter on the morning of the 9th day when Ranger was formally released into his custody, carrying paperwork that corrected the status notation in the federal NWD database from euthanized to retired, reunited with handler. He brought Ranger to the truck and opened the rear door, and the dog jumped in and lay down immediately, the way he had always laid down in vehicles, with his chin on the wheel well and his eyes half open, watching the road the way he had always watched roads, as a thing to be monitored rather than a thing to be relaxed about. They were home before noon. 5 months later, in the long March light that came sideways through the porch windows, Logan sat in the chair he had come to think of as his chair with a cup of coffee, and Ranger across his feet, and the mountains visible through the window in the specific way they were visible when the snow was still on them. But the light had changed, when everything still looked like winter, but the angle of it said spring was making up its mind. Ranger's muzzle had more gray in it than the intake photo had shown. He was slower on cold mornings than he had been in Kandahar. The coin-sized scar on his shoulder was exactly as Logan remembered it, and Logan had run his thumb across it on the first morning home and had not said anything and had not needed to. Carol Steffens had sent a card in November. It had a lab on the front, not a photo of Biscuit, just a generic yellow lab from a card shop. And inside it said only, "I'm so glad Biscuit was being stubborn that morning." Logan had the card on his mantle. He had not taken it down. Sometimes God does not announce himself. Sometimes he sends a yellow Labrador with a stubborn streak and a woman in a canvas coat who had the patience to let the dog have his moment. And through those 2 ordinary things, he routes something extraordinary to the exact place it is supposed to land. The men and women who serve this country are not always failed by enemies. Sometimes they are failed by paperwork, by recording errors, by people in small offices who have decided that the bureaucracy of loss is a resource to be mined rather than a weight to be carried faithfully. Logan Hurst had done everything right. He had served. He had come home. He had done the work of grieving a loss he had every reason to believe was real. What he could not have done alone was find what was still there, waiting for him. That took a dog he had never met, a woman he didn't know, and the kind of grace that doesn't ask to be recognized before it does its work. If Logan and Ranger's story moved you, share it today with someone who needs to be reminded that not everything lost stays lost. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever had a moment where something small led you somewhere you didn't expect to go, tell us about it. Those are the stories that hold us together. If you believe in loyalty, in the grace that works through ordinary moments, and in the veterans who never stop deserving better than they get, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and open your eyes today to whatever it is He's been trying to lead you toward.